Hello, Must Readers. I'm Erin Popelka. I am the founder of Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. And I am so delighted to be here today with Winnie M. Li. Hello, welcome.
Hi, Erin. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I'm really excited to talk about writing and my book and other things.
So, a little bit about Winnie M. Li. She is an author and activist. Her debut novel, Dark Chapter, which I am privileged enough to have a copy of right here. Dark Chapter won the Guardian's Not the Booker Prize in 2017 in the UK, and it will be translated into 9 languages. It was also nominated for the Edgar Award for Best First Novel, highly commended for the CWA Debut Dagger, and shortlisted for the Best First Novel Award. A Harvard graduate, Winnie previously wrote for travel guidebooks and produced independent feature films. After earning a master's in creative writing at Goldsmiths, she now advocates around sexual violence, runs the Clear Lines Festival, and is a PhD researcher in media and communications at the London School of Economics. So we have got so much great stuff to talk about. You are doing such fantastic work. So let's just start at the very beginning. Tell me about when you first knew you wanted to be a writer.
So it was pretty early on in my life. I mean, I would say since the age of 6, I wanted to be a writer. I started reading pretty early. I started reading at 3. I grew up in New Jersey, and my mom very much encouraged me to start reading early. So yeah, most of my childhood, I feel like most of what I did was read. And then like shortly after that, I just started writing stories, and I loved it. So from the age of 6, I always wanted to be a writer. I just never really actually expected that to be a career or really pursued it at first as a career. So, in high school, I wrote for the literary magazine at the newspaper, and I was editor-in-chief of both of them. And yeah, I always loved writing. I just never considered it actually as a career.
Excellent. Well, I am so glad that you have given it a go with this wonderful first novel, Dark Chapter. So let's start there. Tell me about Dark Chapter.
So yeah, so it's my first novel, and I mean, it's funny because I guess I've always wanted to be a writer since the age of 6, and on some level, I always wanted to write a book, but I never really took it seriously on some level. And then on the other hand, I obviously never thought that what my first book would be about this. So I would describe it if I just met somebody in the elevator. I'd say the elevator pitch is it's about a crime which you see equally from the point of view of the victim and the perpetrator. And generally somebody's like, oh, well, that sounds interesting. Tell me more, right? And then I would say, well, it's actually based on a crime that happened to me in real life. And then I would go further and I'd say, well, that crime is actually, it was a rape that I was a victim of 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, in 2008, I was walking in a park outside of Belfast in Northern Ireland, and I was followed by a 15-year-old boy who assaulted and raped me. And that changed my life, as it does for a lot of victims. But I decided I wanted to write a novel that looked at both points of view, both perspectives, and tried to investigate those characters from childhood leading up to that moment of violence, and then look at how their lives are both affected ever afterwards by that one act of violence.
Oh, what a brave thing to explore. And so, you have been really forthright about this being based on your own experience. And so, I guess my question to you is sort of, this is fiction, but how did it feel to explore that past experience through writing the novel?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of, my life was changed dramatically, right? And then, so I wasn't able to write, I've always been a writer, right? So for me, writing's always been how I make sense of the world and all that. So I did write about the experience quite soon after actually living through the trauma. So the entire aftermath I was writing, but I didn't actually try to write the book then. So, for me as a writer, I make a distinction between the kind of writing I do like for myself and just to kind of like deal with life, right? And then there's a very different kind of writing, which is writing it's meant for the public. So even though I've always been a writer, I had this idea even just a few weeks after the assault. So the prologue that I wrote, the prologue in the book was actually something I wrote a few weeks after the assault, bizarrely. And if you read it, it's written from a perspective of somebody years after that assault, looking back on the moments just before it. And so it's kind of weird to think that I actually wrote that just a few weeks after the assault, because I didn't have that perspective in real life. And to this day, I don't really know why I wrote that particular prologue in that way. But I remember writing it and thinking like, okay, well, that's actually pretty good, right? It's pretty good writing. So there was something quite reassuring about that because, after something like rape, you pretty much feel destroyed as a person, right? And I felt like I was never going to be the person I had been before. In some ways that is true, but I felt like I'd never be able to return to that life. So being able to write this like pretty good prologue a few weeks after the assault, I read it and I was like, oh, okay. I mean, like, and it kind of symbolized to me if on some level if I was still able to write, you know, then deep down, despite all the kind of temporary destruction that happened in my life, that meant somewhere deep down I was still me. So I remember saying to myself, like, okay, I'm going to turn this into a book. I'm not ready to write that book yet, but I'm going to wait until I'm ready. So it took about 5.5 years to get to the point where I could write it. So in the meantime, I had to recover, and you know, I had to move countries twice to get a job and this and that. And eventually, it got to a point where I'm like, you know, I think I'm ready to write that book now. But by that point, I'd recovered from the trauma, and I just didn't have as much. It wasn't as raw emotionally, so I had a bit more perspective to write about it as fiction.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting that writing became that through line, that even in the wake of that trauma, just a few weeks after, you were able still to come to it and use writing as a way to touch it in a way even now still feels like a little bit mysterious. So I'm glad writing was a companion for you through that process.
Yeah, and actually, in terms of writing the actual book, once I got to the point of writing it, like, yeah, it was. I mean, it's a tough book to. I mean, it's a tough book to read on some level because it's emotionally, it's quite raw. But you know, it was not easy to write either. I mean, I don't think any novel is easy to write. I'll say that to begin with, right? It's a big mountain of a job there. But for me, it was like, you know, there were two very different characters. There's Vivian, who's the victim, who's very similar to me. And then there's Johnny, who is sort of inspired by my real life rapist, but I know very little about him in real life. So in real life, I knew he was 15. He was from an Irish traveler community, which is sort of a nomadic minority community in Ireland. He was illiterate, so he hadn't had much of a formal education, and he was from a broken family. And then there was DNA evidence, which was taken off my body, you know, in the forensic exam after the assault, which was a partial match to somebody in his family. So it means that somebody in his family had the criminal record. So, and that is pretty much all I know about him. Plus, I've met him during that one incident, right? So it was an interesting kind of creative process to try to take those 5 facts and that brief interaction with him and try to construct, you know, a fully fledged human being. So for me, it was like, okay, how do I imagine what his life had been like before that? You know, what was it like growing up? You know, what is it like, you know, for me as a writer, I can't even imagine what it's like to be illiterate, right? So what is it like to not rely on the written word to communicate? And so it was just such a very different experience from my own upbringing that was quite interesting, creative, but then also sort of, I guess, humanist process for me. So on one hand, he's not a likable character, right? Like, you know, he's a teenage rapist. But on the other hand, like, there are people like that in this world, and they're not born that way. So I felt like it was important to try to understand, you know, what was the process or what was the evolution by which somebody develops into that kind of character. And then for Vivian, I mean, she's much more similar. She's similar to me. I mean, she's pretty much me. You know, there's a few different like details I've made slightly different. But yeah, so it was not as challenging kind of creatively to write her, but emotionally it was more challenging because especially in the part where I'm writing, you know, her weeks and months after the assault, when her life is like very much, you know, completely upended and she's very miserable. I was writing it and I'm like, okay, this is a really bad part of my life. And it was quite sad. And I'd write it and like cry and I'd be like, okay, why am I making myself do this? But then I could always go back to Johnny's section and write, you know, what was a much more kind of like vigorous, active, angry character. So being able to move back and forth between 2 very different characters was actually quite interesting for me. And, you know, in some ways kind of energizing for me as a writer.
Fascinating. That's such a fascinating process. And especially too, like, I mean, it's so incredibly brave for you to imagine the perspective of your rapist, because imagining any character requires some pretty profound empathy. And so for you to do that for your imagined, like a fictional version of your perpetrator, of your rapist, like so brave. Like how did that empathy feel?
I mean, weird, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like, well, you know, weird because on some level, I mean, this is why I would not have been able to write the book like right after the assault, because you know, right after the assault, like I was deeply traumatized. I had to go through a fair amount of therapy and just like time to recover, but also like the emotions were so raw that, you know, there's a lot of anger and hatred towards your perpetrator, which is completely understandable, right?
Yeah.
So on some level, for me, I just had to make a division and be like, okay, like there's the real life individual, and I'm not actually writing about him, right? Like I'm not trying to represent that him. There may be some similarities, but at the end of the day, I'm just using that experience as a starting point for trying to imagine a character that's similar to him. So, but I suppose it was about like, okay, how do we find that empathy? Well, what are the different ways in which we would be able to find something in common with somebody who's so different from us? So he's a younger brother, he's got an older brother who he wishes paid more attention to him, who he eventually kind of resents later on, because the older brother obviously like knows how to move through the world in a different way. At the same time, he's an adolescent, so he hates his parents, right? So we all know what that's been like, right?
Sure.
At the same time, he's got a pretty decent sense of humor. And he kind of wishes the world offered him more, because a lot of it's about kind of growing up as this kind of minority where there's so much prejudice against that particular group of people that there's a sense of like the world doesn't care about me, right? And on some level, I think maybe many of us have been in not exactly that situation, but certainly been at points where we're self-pitying and we're like, nobody cares about us, right? So it's about how do we find those like common moments of emotion that even in a life that's so different from ours, surely everybody in this life has gone through something like that, right? So it felt a bit, bizarre at first, but the more I kind of dug into his character and constructed his character, the more I was like, well, at the end of the day, he's got the same vulnerabilities he's got many vulnerabilities and insecurities in the same way that many of us have those, maybe not those exact kinds of insecurities, but yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for doing that kind of deep exploration, and asking those really hard questions. And the book is incredibly timely in terms of coming out along with this Me Too movement, along with this rising awareness and believing victims and giving victims a chance to tell their stories. And so I guess I'm just really curious, because I think we're also at this really interesting place where we absolutely want to make sure that victims are heard and they have the chance to heal, but these perpetrators are also going to be with us now for many decades to come. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, what does healing look like? Kind of both as a survivor and then also culturally, how do we think about these two sides of this question?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really tough question in a lot of ways. I mean, rape and sexual assault have been happening for all of human history, so it's not like any of this is particularly news. I suppose the news respect is the fact that now all these stories are coming out, and now there's been a sort of public reckoning around, very famous figures. Also, there's some very famous figures who still haven't, been held accountable for their actions, right? But we're starting to realize kind of the prevalence of these experiences and the prevalence of how many victims are out there as well. So yeah, the question in terms of how do we kind of deal with the fact that we're now living with all these perpetrators. So I mean, we've always been living with lots of perpetrators, but now we're living with a lot of visible perpetrators. And I think a lot of it is just what this whole movement is about. Really, I think should be about holding two things. So one is holding perpetrators accountable, right, and realizing that even though they may be famous people, they've done these awful things, and there should be some level of accountability there, right? And certainly to the point where you don't want them to be in a situation where they could, perpetrate again and create more victims, right? So that's one thing. And the other side of the equation is just making sure that there are the support services in place and the kind of culture in place to believe victims and to kind of enable them to recover, right? Because it was years of my life that I was trying to recover, and I'm never going to regain those years, right? And it's 10 years on, and I can still look very, very distinctly at the very different way in which my life went, and if I look at my friends, who didn't go through those kinds of experiences, they're on a very different track, right? And that's just, that's life, right? So I think, but it's important to just bear in mind that perpetrators need to be held accountable. So it's important to make those changes in our policy and in the way things are structured in our society. The criminal justice system isn't really particularly great. There's not a great track record there in terms of convicting perpetrators. So how do we actually change the policy and the procedures in that system to make it easier for victims to report and to be believed, and to make the whole criminal justice process easier for them? I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the book was to kind of just show how much things are stacked against victims in the court case. In real life, I didn't actually have to go through a trial because my perpetrator pleaded guilty the morning of the trial, but I was like, well, if I'm going to write this as a book and if I'm going to write it as fiction, like I am imagining that trial because I want readers to go through essentially, or to try to understand what it's like for victims to have to go through a trial against the rapist and to be asked all these questions, which are incredibly demeaning, and to have to go through the cross-examination. So that's not, you know, I'm hoping somebody would read that book and read my book and understand, like, okay, this is not a good procedure for victims, and like, what can we do to encourage them to report more and to make it easier for them, which will then lead to, lead to more convictions for perpetrators. Yeah, and then even outside of the criminal justice process, like in workplaces, like what are the sexual harassment policies? You know, do they make it easier for the accuser or for the woman to leave her job, or I mean, and make it more difficult for her to continue in that job? You know, what are the resources in place for helping victims, you know, find a way to recover in their lives? So yeah, I think all these need some serious changes. So you actually need kind of structural changes in our policy and the way the systems work in order to encourage a culture for you know, victims to report their experiences and to be believed, and for more perpetrators to be held accountable. So I felt like I rambled a lot. That's like answer your question.
It's a big, complicated question, and I think, you know, what's really fantastic about novels is we can ask these big questions, and in a sense, the novel can be as much of an answer as you can get with these big, complicated questions, right? Because the details are always a little bit different. But imagining like what it would feel like as that victim, what it would feel like to have to go through that criminal justice system that is so set up against you, you know, and then also, you know, very bravely imagining the perpetrator and what would cause someone to come to that moment and, you know, make that horrible act and that horrible decision. So thank you for taking a good look. I am so sorry that your life took this change in trajectory, but thank you for talking about it and for continuing to raise the conversation and to raise awareness, you know, and thank you for making Dark Chapter.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and so Dark Chapter has won some fantastic awards, including the Not the Booker Prize 2017 from The Guardian. And you've also just you're wrapping up the end of a really long book tour. So thank you for talking with me after many months of being on the road and traveling with Dark Chapter. I just wanted to kind of close with, if you have any highlights or special moments connecting with readers or other writers, like how has it been to be on tour with Dark Chapter?
Yeah, I mean, it's been great. I mean, it's been on one hand like exhausting, right? Because I'm
Yes.
right, you know, and then on the other hand, it's been also energizing because, you know, every time I speak, at least I've met other people who've read the book, and it means a lot to them because, you know, again, I wrote the book on one level to do justice to the survivor's experience, because I've never seen that being represented in literature particularly well. So yeah, it means a lot to me when I speak and people will come up to me afterwards. Like actually every time I speak, at least one person will come up to me and say that, you know, they're a victim as well, or they're a survivor as well. And that means a great deal to me, right? So it's been, you know, when the book came out in the UK, June 1st of 2017. So, I mean, you told me at the end of July I'd still be like doing talks. I'm like, what are you talking about, right? Like, I do not have the energy for that. But like somehow I've lasted through it. But there was lots of stuff I didn't expect to have happen, right? I mean, I got invited to a literary festival in South Africa, so I went down to Durban last autumn. That was really cool. My Korean publishers decided to fly me out to Korea to do a whole kind of promotional tour there. So that was great. And then I got asked in like April or May if I wanted to do this TED Talk. So it was like, yeah, okay, I'll do a TED Talk, right? TEDx Talk. So, so yeah, I mean, on one hand, it's been like, you know, trying to get this out there, and then I mean, you can't predict like who's going to read it or who's going to hear like, you know, a radio interview with me or what have you, or read a newspaper article, and then they're putting their own event together. So it's been great to just realize that there is so many people out there who care about this issue, but then also there's a whole other angle to it, which is the crime fiction angle. So I got nominated for the Edgar Award in the US, which I wasn't expecting at all. So I got to like, you know, meet Jeffrey Deaver and talk to like, you know, some top crime writers. So yeah, it's been great just to see that so many people have engaged with the book on different angles, through different angles, and like from different places in this world. Probably one of the most meaningful moments for me was in Korea. You know, when I got flown out to Korea by my publishers, they had actually moved up the publication date of the book because the metoo movement started this whole kind of very big public reckoning in Korea. And, you know, that's a country where there's never been a very public conversation about sexual assault and harassment, even though, you know, some people would say it's a very patriarchal country, and so a lot of these stories have been suppressed. But, you know, of course, sexual assault and harassment happens, you know, there as it does in every country, right? So in the wake of the Me Too movement, you know, there's been a number of like very public accusations against, you know, political leaders and professors in Korea, which have led to resignations. So my publishers were like, okay, this is like very topical now, so we're gonna move up the publication date and fly Winnie out there. And so on one hand, it was like completely nuts, right? I had jet lag, obviously. I flew over there, and like within 2.5 hours of stepping off the plane, I had to do like a live, like, well, not a live TV interview, but I had to do a TV interview, right? So like, let me be coherent, you know? Like, I'm just on a 10-hour flight, you know. And then it was like 5 days, and every day I had like at least 3 to 4 media interviews or something, right? You know, I did a big sort of TEDx style talk to like 600 people with television cameras, and then I had like a 1-hour lecture that I gave to like students at the women's university. So, you know, and then I had like a conversation with Korea's leading feminist scholar. So that was really quite cool, but it was like definitely like a step up in terms of like what I was being asked to do. But this whole time I was doing it like jet lag with translators. But yeah, on the other hand, it meant a lot to a lot of the survivors who came. So I had like a special session with survivors and activists, and my last event was at like a feminist cafe, with, you know, mainly speaking to an audience of kind of counselors that work with sexual assault survivors. So I think it meant a lot to them just to have another person, you know, another woman be that open about her experiences, and it being like a woman from like the West, you know, admittedly, you know, I'm, you know, Chinese American or Taiwanese American, so we look more similar to Koreans, but at the same time, it's like it's just an acknowledgement of the fact that these experiences happen and the impact is that big, and unfortunately it is an experience that happens worldwide. So it can bring a lot of survivors together when we're in a space where we can share our stories. So that was quite meaningful for me. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you for being on a global book tour with Dark Chapter, and including Must Read Fiction as part of that conversation. And thank you for the, you know, really brave and important work that you're doing. And thank you for continuing to write. I know that, you know, things are still rolling for you in terms of book number 2. So keep up the fantastic work.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks so much. I mean, and thanks for, you know, inviting me on to Must Read Fiction. It's been a great conversation.
It's truly been my pleasure. Thank you.